Speaking as somebody who's played more than his fair share of Metroidvanias, I can pretty confidently say that the Shantae series is by far the most charming, funniest, and weirdest I've ever played. Developed by wayforward, Shantae as a series had it pretty rough for a while. Due to a combination of factors, the original game flopped pretty hard in the sales department. Like, it only sold 25,000 copies poorly. This made finding a publisher to fund the game's sequel, Risky's Revolution, basically impossible, so development on it had to be halted entirely until very recently, and a new game wouldn't be seen until 2010 with Risky's Revenge, a whole 8 years after the first game's release. Nowadays, Shantae doesn't have it nearly as rough, and over time it's become a pretty solid series, with some really great games that have an even greater sense of humor. So with Risky's Revolution actually going to see the light of day at some point this year, I thought it would be fun to cover every single game in the series all in one video, with hope that I might convince some of you to give this wonderfully odd and charming series a shot if you haven't already. The series' protagonist Shantae is a half-genie resident of Sequinland who works as the guardian for Scuttletown, and the first game has her put to work immediately as it starts with the town being raided by the lady pirate Risky Boots. During the raid, Risky stole an ancient artifact that Shantae's uncle Mimic found called the Steam Engine, which he plans on using to create a weapon of mass destruction in order to help her conquer the world. In order to actually make it, though, she'll need to get her hands on 4 special ancient slabs scattered around the world, so Shantae's goal is of course to get her hands on them before Risky does. While the first game hasn't quite developed the same sense of humor the series would have later, as an introduction to the main cast and the world itself, it does its job well enough. The story itself may not be anything crazy at all, but characters like Shantae, her uncle Mimic, the lovable moron Bolo, and Sky are all pretty likable and really fun members of the cast, and Risky herself is a great recurring villain. I also like how the Steam Engine is used for world building. To us, something like a Steam Engine is pretty primitive, but here it's this powerful piece of ancient technology that helps paint an interesting picture for the world of Shantae. All that being said though, we need to take a moment to appreciate just how good this game looks. Putting aside that the footage you're seeing is from the GBA enhanced version of it, the original Shantae is one of the best looking games on the Game Boy Color. The sprite work for all of the characters and enemies is very well done. The environments look great, and they're made all the better by the GBA enhanced version of the game, and the animations are really impressive. The original Shantae is a very pretty game for the console it was on, and in that regard it still holds up fairly well, unlike a number of other things about the game, but more on that in a moment. In between the 4 main dungeons, you'll be going from town to town and exploring Sequinland for upgrades and collectibles by using Shantae's various animal forms, the magic items you can buy from shops, and of course her hair, which she's somehow managed to weaponize. For her animal forms this time around, we have the monkey for climbing walls, the elephant for breaking stone blocks, the spider for also climbing walls, but this time it's inner ones, so it's totally different, and the harpy form for flying. As for the collectibles, you have things like heart holders for more health, fireflies which you can use to unlock a healing dance, and special items for giving your animal forms a new attack. This is unfortunately where we have to get into the more frustrating parts of the game though, like with the enemies. They can be very tanky, and with their health doubling at night, there are some that can take 10 hits to kill. Which sure, may not sound like much, but when your basic attack has this little range, getting hit becomes fairly likely without using magic items. Frankly, there's so many enemies in each area, it's honestly better to just spam the Vanishing Cream item to become invincible and run past everything. It's way faster, and aside from money drops, you're not missing out on anything. There are other little things about the game that bother me, like the more clunky feeling controls and the brutally difficult race with Roddy Tops prior to the 3rd dungeon, but most of this can be chalked up to the game being a product of its time. If you're used to older games like this, or if you're more patient than I am, some of these things probably won't bother you that much, so I don't feel too comfortable holding it against the game. I mean heck, I can potentially even look past the race you have to do against Roddy Tops. Long story short, it's a hard, fast-paced obstacle course where you need to make it to the end before she does to get the 3rd dungeon opened. And as a not-so-fun fact, I did this under the effects of a fairly severe migraine with no painkillers to speak of. I hadn't played this game in the series before this video, so for all I know, it's not actually that hard, and my headache just made it twice or even 3 times as difficult. I can't, however, look past the inclusion of a frickin' live system. Yes, for reasons I can't even begin to understand, someone on the dev team thought it would be a good idea to include a live system of all things in an action-adventure title. Things like bottomless pits and spikes all kill you in one shot, and with how close the screen is and how much the overworld loves the former, I can promise you'll be seeing the game over screen a lot unless you're either really patient and cautious or you're using save states. Frankly, this combined with the enemies just makes the act of exploring and going from place to place more aggravating than fun. The knowledge that if I die enough, I'll have to go right back to my last save cave does nothing but give me anxiety, because areas in this one can get large in size, and unlike later games in the series, the original Shantae isn't exactly liberal with save points. Even for the time, this inclusion doesn't really make much sense, and it's the biggest reason that I find the first game in the series so frustrating to play, which honestly really sucks because the dungeons are actually kinda fun. Along with being Metroidvanias, almost every game in the Shantae series also has elements of a Zelda-like with the dungeons, and for the first game of the series, they're genuinely not too bad. With one exception, they're not really that special mechanically, but they all look just as great as everything else, and they were easily my favorite parts of the game. In the dungeons, you'll be finding keys to progress, as well as a guardian genie that, when found, will grant Shantae a new dance that'll let her change into one of the previously mentioned animal forms. These are one of the series' biggest staples, and while it's a super creative idea for giving you a new movement upgrade as well as abilities, it's a bit rough in the first game purely for how you change form. Transforming requires you to hit the dance button and input that animal form's button combo, with the catch being that each one needs to be pressed in time with the first star on the dance gauge. Honestly, while I do think it's a cute touch, it feels fairly unnecessary. All it really does is make transforming take longer than it needs to. On the note of the dances though, you also have 5 baby warp squids per dungeon. If you can get 4 of them back to a town's mother warp squid, you'll get a fast travel dance for that town. This is all well and good, but apparently they can't properly recognize their own children, and while that's definitely funny, it does have me concerned that I may have accidentally misplaced a lot of adorable squid children. Out of every dungeon in the game, my favorite has to go to the Golem Mine. It's the one that stands out the most from all of them, with its color changing mechanic, and it handles spikes and pits the best in my opinion. Its boss, the King Golem, isn't really anything special, but honestly, that goes for basically every boss fight in this game. They may look cool, but honestly, there really isn't much going on with them here. As a whole, while the dungeons are fun and definitely the highlight of the game for me, they aren't anything crazy, like I said before. The level design as well as boss fights are something every other game in this series would handle much better. If I'm being honest though, while I think you could definitely really enjoy this game if you have the patience for things like the frustrating enemies and somehow the live system, it's undeniable that the original Shantae hasn't aged all that well. Out of every game in the series, it's definitely the worst one to start with. The game's sequel, Risky's Revenge, though, is a much better place to start. Initially released for the DSi in 2010, it would later be brought to modern consoles in the form of the game's director's cut. Story-wise, while all of the same characters are present, you don't really need to know anything about the first game to understand this one, since the plot of Risky's Revenge is written as if you hadn't played it at all. Taking place sometime after the first game, Shantae's still doing her job as Scuttletown's guardian genie, when during Mimic's newest artifact showcase, he breaks it open, only to reveal an oil lamp that Risky immediately swoops in to steal. To rub salt in the wound, Shantae's then fired as Scuttletown's guardian genie by its mayor when she fails to bring in Risky after their fight. As for the lamp though, according to Mimic, it's a very powerful and very dangerous weapon that had its power locked away by 3 separate magical seals that are hidden across Sequin Land. Now what the lamp actually does though, Mimic refuses to say, but given what it looks like and the fact that this is a game series involving genies with our protagonist being a half genie, I think you and everyone else watching this already have a pretty good idea of what this lamp does. So Shantae's goal is to travel across Sequin Land and find the 3 magic seals before Risky does. And story as well as writing wise, this is definitely a good few steps above the first game. Before, the whole story was just about stopping Risky Boots, but here there's an extra layer of mystery surrounding it. Obviously the lamp is dangerous, but nobody aside from Mimic and Risky knows what it even does, so nobody's even sure what Risky's going to do with it. This is also where the series' writing started to become what it is nowadays. The main cast are given a bit more focus this time around, which helps make them more charming characters than before. Risky's Revenge is also where we get the introduction for one of the series' funniest returning characters, Squid Baron. He's this adorable and weird squid dude who's somehow kind of self-aware about the fact that he's in a video game. Like how he makes remarks about how he survived the screen-clearing explosion when you beat him earlier in the game. And on that note, the humor is definitely cranked up a bit here. Characters have more funny quips as well as interactions. I won't go deep into it since a lot of the funnier bits are just smaller bits of dialogue, but needless to say, this is where the series' great humor really started to show itself, and it's only up from here. The story isn't the only thing that's been improved though, because gameplay-wise, Risky's Revenge is better than the first game in every way. First off, Shantae controls way better here. The first game had an old-school clunkiness to the way it felt with moving and jumping around, but here everything feels way smoother. The enemies also aren't nearly as annoying. They're much easier to deal with, and pits as well as spikes no longer instantly kill you, and instead they just do damage and send you back to where you entered the room from. Fast travel's also been expanded on. Instead of 5 warp dances, you have these warp squids that you can wake up and use to fast travel to other warp squids across the world, which makes getting around way easier. The animal transformations have also been tweaked as well. This time, all you have to do is hold down the dance button and let go when it gets to that transformation's corresponding dance move. And with there being only 3 of them this time around, it makes changing forms way faster. As for the forms themselves though, we have the monkey returning, now with newly purple-colored fur, who also sports the new Monkey Bullet Air Dash for platforming. We have the elephant form, which is exactly the same as it was before, and the mermaid for swimming underwater. The magic items from the last game also got some much-needed readjusting, but in a much bigger way. Instead of needing to buy multiples of them to use like they were normal items, here they work more like new additions or spells to your arsenal. By getting enough money as well as finding enough magic gems scattered throughout the world, you can buy upgraded versions of them as well as other passive effects like more damage and an item magnet. The dungeons have also been improved due in large part to the lack of instant death traps and a live system, but also because the bosses are much more fun to fight, with them having more interesting movesets. All of these changes help make Risky's Revenge a much better and more fun experience compared to the last game. It's nowhere near as frustrating, it's smoother to control as well as play, and it even has a stronger feeling of progression thanks to the changes and new additions with magic. It's just a shame, though, that Risky's Revenge is by far the shortest game in the series, with it having only 2 dungeons and being a little over 4 hours long normally. And honestly, I couldn't even begin to tell you why. Like, everything about this game is such a vast improvement over the first, but for as good as Risky's Revenge is, its short runtime leaves me feeling a good bit unsatisfied by the end. Honestly, if there was even just 1 or 2 more dungeons, I feel like I'd be okay with the game being as short as it is, but as it stands, it's a big part of the reason I can't say it's the best place to start the series with. That honor would have to go to The Pirate's Curse, the game I initially started with and what many fans consider to be the best game in the series. Following the events of Risky's Revenge, Shantae's lost her genie magic and is now fully human thanks to the lamp Risky stole. After Shantae's put under house arrest when she tries to fight off Scuttletown's new owner, the Ammo Baron, she's then forcibly taken to her uncle's workshop by Risky Boots with a fake bathtub. Side note, it's also here we learn that Shantae apparently doesn't own a bathtub, and I'm not gonna lie, that's both kinda gross and makes me wonder how she takes care of her hair. After interrogating Shantae about why Mimic's taken one of her Tinkerbats, these little black dudes that make up her pirate crew, it's then corrupted by dark magic and transformed into a Cacklebat, which according to Risky can only mean the Pirate Master's somehow returning. The Pirate Master was Risky's old boss, and one of the greatest threats Sequin Land's ever seen. At the height of his power, he was so strong that it took the combined might of the entire Genie race in order to put him in a grave. So in order to prevent him from returning completely, Shantae and Risky set out to destroy each of the 5 sources of evil he's gaining power from. Honestly, out of every game in the series, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse has arguably its best overall story. The actual plot is simple, but the character writing is stronger than it's ever been, with a few members of the main cast becoming more than just charming and funny characters. As an example, in Pirate's Curse, we somehow meet human Roddy Tops in the village of Lost Souls, which makes both her character and existence way more interesting and even sympathetic, since we get to see a side of her she doesn't show people. Honestly, this was the point where Roddy Tops became my favorite character in the series. I already liked her personality and writing before, but this whole part of the plot makes her even better. As another example, Shantae's always been a fun and likable protagonist, but here we actually get to see a pretty interesting side of her, in that she actually wants Risky to become a good guy. Even after she tried to kill her multiple times, threatened her family's life, and even took away her genie half, the only connection she has with her mother, she's willing to extend an olive branch to make peace with her and genuinely wants Risky to join their side. The writing for the characters themselves isn't the only thing that's been improved though, because this is where the series' humor goes from good to great. There are so many funny moments in the game. In fact, there's so many I couldn't tell you what my favorites are. There's a dragon boss named Dagron, the massively misspelled monstrosity. Basically, anything involving Squid Baron is great as usual, and really the entirety of Tan Line Island was a weird and comedic highlight of the game. I can guarantee you that at minimum, there will be plenty of moments that either get a smile or chuckle out of you, especially because of how weird the game gets. Yeah, it's time we finally touch on the title of this video, because until now, the weirdness has been with smaller things, like how coffee can make zombies go from completely feral to being your average human, but with a bit of a taste for raw flesh and brains. Here, though, you'll have moments like how you get into the first dungeon. First off, you have to absorb the stink from a ham that you cook by spinning it with your hair, so you can get a giant lizard to salivate a waterfall. This then allows these ladies on spring break to finally relax in what they believe is water, which, combined with how white they are, yes, I'm serious, then causes the sun's light to reflect off of their bodies, thus giving you the petrify spell. You then take it to this old guy whose wife was petrified by the island's boss decades ago, and after using it to cure his wife, actually just petrifies him too. The then combined weight of him and his stone wife creates a hole in the ground, thus opening the way to the first dungeon, and this entire sequence only takes about 5 or 6 minutes. 7 tops. There's plenty of larger and even smaller moments of weirdness like this in the story, and honestly, I kinda love it. It gets really funny, and it helps make both the characters and the world all the more charming and memorable. Now that we're at the Pirate's Curse, I also want to take a moment to appreciate how consistently good the character designs are, as highlighted by this game's art style. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is tied with the 5th game for my favorite art style in the series, and aside from the fact that it just looks really good, it also does these designs a lot of justice. They're all just as charming or interesting as they are visually appealing. They all do a great job at telling you a bit about that character's personality just from your first look at them, and it's something I feel almost every important character in the series has in common. All that being said though, now's about time I explain exactly why so many fans believe Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is the best game in the series, and while everything else I just mentioned is definitely a part of it, the biggest reason is that it's a great game with no major flaws to speak of. You have a lot of the same returning elements as before, but with some big changes this time around. Because Shantae doesn't have her Genie powers here, there's no magic gauge to speak of, meaning items like the Pike Ball are back to being sold individually at shops. And instead of just potions for healing, Shantae now also has food items enemies can drop that she can eat to heal. How you get more health is also different this time around. Instead of finding heart holders, you have to find these adorable little guys called heart squids. Once you find 4, all you have to do is take them back to the Squidsmith in Scuttletown so that she can then melt them down to make more health for you. Look, in all seriousness though, this is the first and so far only time a Metroidvania has made me morally uncomfortable with the idea of using collectibles to increase my health. Like, I'm gonna keep doing it since I kinda need the extra hearts, but why did these guys need to be so adorable? There is another new collectible this time around you need to look out for with the Cackle Bats. You'll have to find all 20 bats and beat the dark magic right out of them and absorb it using the lamp from the last game if you want the game's true ending. With the exception of the one hidden in the sewers in Scuttletown, none of them were too difficult to find at all. And if you are missing one, the game will actually let you know since each island has listed exactly how many Cackle Bats and Heart Squids are left, which is a quality of life feature I always appreciate in my Metroidvanias. The biggest and most important change though is the lack of animal forms from the previous 2 games. Instead, Shantae uses Risky's old equipment that's been locked away in each of the 5 dungeons by the Pirate Master's servants. And up to this point, the pirate gear is far better than the animal forms have ever been. For starters, they're all way faster to use, since instead of having to dance to activate them, they can all be instantly accessed with the press of a button. The only exception being the boots, since they're basically this game's version of Metroid's Speed Booster, in that they need a running start in order to be used. And secondly, they all just flow better. Constantly stopping to transform does break the pacing of the gameplay, especially when in some cases you didn't need to be in a form for more than 10 to 15 seconds. Here though, each piece of equipment feels like a proper extension of your own moveset and abilities, and because everything is instant, you can easily string together abilities in ways you couldn't with previous games. It all just makes everything feel better paced, much faster, and even more fun than before. The dungeons are also at their best here, with them being a big improvement over the last 2 games, both aesthetically and mechanically. Each one is visually unique and very well designed, with up to this point the series' best roster of bosses. They all do a great job at effectively utilizing whatever pirate equipment you have for the puzzles, and I like that each dungeon now has 3 heart squids to find, since it makes the dungeons now feel like a proper fusion of the series' Metroidvania roots and its Zelda-like aspects. My favorite dungeon in the game has to go to Tanline Island's Lost Catacombs. Its puzzles are really good and its item the scimitar is great, but honestly the biggest reason is that it has my second favorite boss fight in the game with Squid Baron. He has the most interesting and fun fight outside of the final boss, and it's also the funniest both for the dialogue and how it's been foreshadowed multiple times since the beginning of the adventure, with Squid Baron's whole "I feel like I'm gonna end up being a filler boss" comment. Honestly, I don't really have anything super negative to say about this game. The story and writing is fantastic, and some of the series' best, with it having some great development and moments for the cast, a strong sense of humor, and new lore that makes the world all the more interesting. Everything about the exploration and gameplay is great, from how it feels to play to all of the new abilities, changes, and mechanics, with up to this point the strongest set of dungeons and bosses the series had seen yet. Like I said earlier, it's a great game with no major flaws. What it does right, it does really right, and by the end there won't really have been anything that you might consider a major rough spot. Out of every game in the series, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is easily the best one to start with, and it's considered one of Shantae's best games, if not outright its best, for a reason. Released a few years after it though, we have the series' black sheep, half Genie hero. A lot of you will probably know this game from its Kickstarter back in 2013, a little more than 10 years ago. The game released a positive reception from fans and critics, but its very different gameplay style and even structure to its story made Half Genie Hero, for better or worse, the franchise's oddball. By 2018, though, the game got a re-release with its Ultimate Edition that included all of its DLC and backer-exclusive content with no extra charge, making it by far a better package compared to what it was originally, but more on all of this later. Story-wise, the plot for Half Genie Hero is kinda weird. Taking place sometime after the Pirate's Curse, with her powers now restored, the game starts with Shantae having been woken up in the middle of the night by a mysterious voice who says they're messenger from the Genie realm. Apparently, something evil is going to do something really bad soon, and only Shantae can stop it. The next morning, Shantae meets up with her uncle Mimic, who's been working on a device called the Dynamo that's supposed to help make Shantae's job as the town's guardian genie easier by preventing attacks from monsters and pirates. Like clockwork, though, Risky then drops in and steals the blueprints for Mimic's new invention for herself, which now marks the third time something like this has happened to the man. Shantae actually manages to stop her this time and gets the blueprints back. What then follows is Shantae helping Mimic with building the Dynamo, while other unrelated stuff just happens. Half Genie Hero's story is pretty episodic in nature. There technically is an overarching plot, but the focus is more on all of the other subplots that Shantae needs to deal with, since usually it involves someone doing something evil. While I can't say I don't enjoy this story structure, since oddly enough it almost feels right at home with this series, the story is definitely a downgrade compared to the Pirate's Curse. It has its own charming moments and fun writing like usual, but after everything that happened in the previous game, I wish we got something that didn't feel so disconnected from it. But like I said though, the series' trademark charm and humor is still just as present in Half Genie Hero as it is in the last game, which really helps make the story more enjoyable. On a much more positive note though, the game's presentation is as gorgeous as it is charming. All of the 3D environments in the game are very well done, and they add a nice depth to each area in the game, and I love the whole 2.5D look Half Genie Hero goes for. Then there's the sprites, and I love these even more. I absolutely love games with a hand-drawn art style, and Half Genie Hero's sprites all look great and are wonderfully animated. While I prefer the Pirate's Curse's art style for character portraits a bit more, Half Genie Hero is easily one of wayforward's best looking and even sounding games. I won't go deep into it since I'm not great at talking about music, but even if you don't end up playing this game, you owe it to yourself to give this soundtrack a listen. It's fantastic. And you know what, while you're at it, go ahead and listen to the Pirate Curse's soundtrack too. It's just as good if not better. Getting to the actual gameplay though, now that Shantae has her genie magic back, we have plenty of returning elements from previous games, like the magic gauge from Risky's Revenge and magic items being like normal spells again instead of individual items. Similarly, Shantae's animal transformations also make a reappearance, but are much faster to actually use. Instead of waiting on a specific dance move, each one is mapped to one of 4 different directions across multiple scrolling sections. There's also tons of them this time around, with there being 8 normal ones and a bunch of other optional ones if you're interested. For returning forms, you have things like the monkey, elephant, harpy, mermaid, and the spider form, now with 50% more human. As for the new required forms, we have the bat form for flying horizontally, the crab for tighter underwater exploration, and the mouse for itty-bitty passages. While they're not quite as fast-paced or fluid as the pirate gear was in the previous game, they're a massive improvement over what they've been in the past, and they all feel great to play around with, even if some of them aren't quite as useful as others, like the spider form, which really makes me sad because I love the look for this one. With that being said though, it's at this point that I should address how exactly Half Genie Hero is different from previous entries with its gameplay. For starters, wayforward decided to go in a very different direction by making the game more of an action platformer with light Metroidvania elements this time around. Instead of larger areas, we have 6 relatively linear levels to run through. Each one doesn't usually take that long to play through on your first run, but just like a Metroidvania, there are still plenty of upgrades and collectibles to find in most of them. Upgrades include heart holders for more health, as well as items with passive effects and new abilities for all of your animal forms hidden in these genie realms. Aside from anything related to side quests, you'll also have 10 of these art galleries to look out for. These are for opening up each of the 10 doors in Scuttletown's art gallery, with each one having some concept art for the game. Open all 10 though, and the mayor will reward you with this tiara that gives you infinite magic, and given that there's literally an invincibility spell that runs on said magic, this makes that item very overpowered. Every level in the game is fun to play through, and thanks to the spectacular presentation, they're all really memorable for one reason or another, with my personal favorite being Mermaid Falls. It's got my favorite level theme in the game, and I love the story for it, with it being this weird counterfeit mermaid operation the Techno Baron's running since he can't get enough actual mermaids to make Monster Chow with. Its boss, the Giga Mermaids, also tied for my favorite one in the game with the Squid Baron. They're both fun fights in their own right, but I love how each has two distinct separate phases that greatly change the fight. Outside of final bosses, this is something I don't think the series has done quite enough of. With that being said though, I do have a problem with them as well as the base game as a whole, and ironically enough for me, it has to do with the Metroidvania elements. You see, here's the thing. In Half Genie Hero, you'll be doing a lot of backtracking for collectibles and upgrades like usual, but in between levels, you'll also be collecting other things for side quests that you'll need to do in order to progress the story. Now don't get me wrong at all. On its own, something like this isn't a problem for me. Metroidvanias are one of my favorite subgenres. I'm perfectly fine with and really enjoy backtracking when it's handled right. The problem is that for the most part, I'm predominantly just re-exploring the same 3 or 4 levels. The last 2 levels don't have much in them to find, with the final one not having anything at all since it's the last level in the game, so most stuff in the game is concentrated in the first 4, and I just got sick of constantly having to revisit the exact same places. Heck, half the time it's not even for upgrades or collectibles that can get you cool stuff. It's miscellaneous items I need in order to progress the plot. Honestly, I feel like I'd enjoy Half Genie Hero's base game more if it had less backtracking and added fluff from all the side quests. As it stands, while each stage was definitely a lot of fun to play through, the extra fluff all of the forced backtracking adds just makes playing the game a bit more tedious and frustrating for me. Thankfully for me though, we have all the other side modes to help make up for that. We have some standard ones like hard mode, but more interestingly, we have a mode for risky, one that stars Sky as well as Bolo and Roddy Tops called Friends to the End, and like 4 separate modes for Shantae, each one with their own entirely unique gameplay styles. Starting from the top, we have everyone's favorite pirate queen, Risky Boots, whose campaign is kind of a better version of the base game for me. The story here is simple. It's all about explaining how Risky collected the components for building her super weapon, the Tinker Brain she uses in the final level of the base game. What follows is you revisiting each of the game's 5 main levels in any order you want to collect the parts needed. Risky also plays completely differently to Shantae. For starters, she has most of her pirate gear from the last game, with her now packing a grappling hook for sticking and sliding across ceilings and bombs for blowing up rocks that are directly in front of her. Instead of magic items like Shantae has, she instead uses different types of ammunition for her pistol, with there being a homing shot, a triple shot, and the previously mentioned bombs. All of her attributes like health, damage, and even her gear and abilities can be upgraded by collecting dark magic found in each level. For me, the biggest improvement and the thing that makes Risky's campaign better is that none of the excess fluff is here. Backtracking isn't as frustrating or tedious as it is in the base game, which makes it more fun to play for me and gives the mode much better pacing. Up next, we have Friends Till the End, which takes place during the part of the story where Shantae was made temporarily evil for all of like 30 seconds. So after she accidentally opens up a portal into her own mind, Sky, Bolo, and Roddy Tops jump inside in an attempt to fix their friend. It's a simple story with them all learning how to put aside their differences and work together to save their friend. It's not much, but it works well enough. I gotta say though, I really love this scene at the raceway where it's revealed in her memories that Shantae sees Roddy Tops as a human and not as a zombie. It's a really sweet moment that helps cement why Shantae is such a great and lovable protagonist. Putting all that wholesomeness aside though, Friends Till the End gameplay-wise is a completely different beast than anything that's come before in this series, and I sincerely hope you're ready for pain. Friends Till the End, like every other remaining mode in the game, axes the Metroidvania elements entirely and plays more like a pure action platformer. In terms of its structure, you go through most of the same levels as usual, but with less of an emphasis on exploration and the addition of 3 playable characters that can all level up and get stronger by collecting what's normally the series' currency in gems. Each of the 3 playable characters all share a health bar, but they have vastly different abilities and methods for attacking, with them all having specials they can use by burning some of their special gauge. For starters, Sky here can attack by throwing a bird as if it were a boomerang. She can throw an egg to create a temporary bird platform for a few seconds, and for her special ability, she can create a bird version of the pike balls. Bolo attacks by using a flail which can break rocks, he can use his spring clawed hook to these grapple boots he can swing off of, and for his special, he throws a bouncing spike ball. Roddy Tops attacks by beating monsters with her own leg and can teleport by tossing her head, with Roddy Tops also being your only method of healing with her special being her eating a brain. And trust me when I say you're gonna need this because Friends Till the End is not for the faint of heart. This mode is by far one of the hardest things in the entire series. With you having only 3 hearts and very limited healing, death is an ever-looming threat, and its later levels won't leave you much room for error, both from enemies of course, and also because the platforming sections get pretty brutal. As an example, the second to last level, the Hypno Baron's Castle, took me a little more than an hour, almost purely for its second half and boss. A big part of it is because when you touch a spike or fall into a pit, you're sent back to the beginning of that section, so if either of those things happen and you're nearing the end, you have to do all of that over again. The other reason is because I got to the fight with Squid Baron with no healing at all, and with only 3 hearts to my name, that meant I had to beat both phases without getting hit 6 times. And with how fast-paced and chaotic this fight gets, doing that is easier said than done. Let me tell you, the very generous invincibility frames Roddy Top's head toss has is the entire reason this fight was winnable for me. Unlike Shantae, the best friend squad over here doesn't have great movement options for avoiding attacks. With any other character, I didn't really have a good way of avoiding damage. If you're a fan of really difficult platformers, you'll definitely enjoy this mode. It's very challenging, but for those who don't, I'd stay away. Friends Till the End is good in its own right, but it's pretty unforgiving, and I honestly wouldn't blame anyone if they couldn't finish it. Then we have the 4 costume modes for Shantae, and structure-wise, these are all the same as Friends Till the End, but with Shantae having different abilities in each of them and varying levels of difficulty. Jammy's mode has Shantae in her pajamas, with her trying to gather up everyone she's met for a sleepover at her place. Here she attacks enemies by beating them with her pillow, and by tossing sheep at them with her special gauge. And for platforming, she can curl up into a cloud and sleep to fly high into the air for a short time. Out of all of them, this one's definitely the easiest and the most enjoyable. In ninja mode, Shantae's trying to become a master ninja by learning from scrolls she bought online with the costume. This time she uses a sword to attack as well as kunai with her special gates that get stronger and multiplies as she levels up. For movement, she can now wall jump as well as teleport in any direction, which is honestly pretty fun to mess with. Officer mode is Shantae dressing up as Patty from another of wayforward series' Mighty Switch Force, with her and Mimic trying to capture space hooligans, who for this game are represented by Risky Boots, Roddy Tops, and Twitch and Vinegar, as well as Sky. This mode plays basically the same as Mighty Switch Force, but with more simplified puzzles. If you enjoyed that game like I do, or puzzle platformers in general, you'll definitely like this mode. Beach mode has Shantae trying to find the perfect spot in Sequin Land to work on her tan, and full transparency here, I do not like this mode. See, the main problem comes from this one's unique mechanic with the sun gauge. For some reason, Shantae's at risk of sunburning in like 15 to 20 seconds if she's either not in water or constantly applying sunblock. If that gauge fills, you'll start taking damage, and when you have no reliable method for healing, barring enemy drops, and you only have 3 hearts, the whole mode starts to feel very unfair. At least in Friends Till the End, while it might still be a bit unbalanced, it still felt fair since you could actually heal there. Here, I legitimately had to stop playing halfway through the desert because I just wasn't enjoying myself. Either that sun gauge needed to last 2 times longer, or alternatively, I needed more health or more ways to heal, because as it currently stands, beach mode is too unfair to be fun for me. As a whole though, I do think Half Genie Hero was a really good game. The writing is still really charming, even if I wish the story was handled differently. Its presentation is gorgeous, with some of the series' prettiest visuals. And for all of my issues, it's really fun to play, with beach mode being an exception. And finally, we have the most recent game in the series with Shantae and the Seven Sirens. Released back in 2019, this was the series' return to form, though going back to the Metroidvania-focused gameplay that Shantae was known for. It was positively received, but was heavily criticized for how easy it was, amongst other things we'll get more into later. In 2021, though, the game would get the spectacular Superstar update, which would add multiple new modes, one of which being an updated version of the base game called Definitive Mode, which completely rebalances the game and adds new quality of life features and some story bits. The other 4 modes consist of the original version of the game as well as Beginner, Rule Breaker, and Full Deck mode, but since those don't change the game too much beyond the difficulty or a mechanic we'll address later, I'll be focusing almost entirely on Definitive mode. This time around, Shantae and friends find themselves on vacation at Paradise Island after being invited by the mayor of Arena Town to attend their Half Genie festival in celebration of other Half Genies. So for the first time in the series, we actually get to meet other Half Genies besides Shantae, the whole 5 of them. We have the Electric Half Genie Zapple, the Healing Half Genie Vera, the Seer Half Genie Plink, the Zombie Half Genie Fill in to Blank, and finally we have the oldest Half Genie Harmony, whose powers aren't outright stated, but we know she can make fireworks and earthquakes. While this is all great for Shantae, things go south pretty quick when during the festival's Half Genie performance, they all mysteriously disappear after the lights go out, with the exception of Shantae herself. Somehow they were all taken by the Seven Sirens, a group of aquatic-themed monster women who've captured the other half genies for unknown reasons. So like usual, it's up to Shantae to explore the ancient sunken city below the island to rescue all of them and figure out exactly what's going on and why, all while dealing with the returning Risky Boots, who's after some kind of treasure. A lot of the Seven Sirens story is a mystery. We don't totally know what's up with the Sirens, what their goals are, and what the other half genies have to do with this. As a setup, I really like what they did here. The introduction of the other half genies and their disappearance makes it feel more personal for Shantae, since this is the first time in her life she's met anyone else like her, and the introduction of the Sirens as a race expands on the world in a fairly interesting way. With that being said though, while the Superstar update did sort of address this next bit, I do still have some issues with the storytelling, and it's geared entirely towards the Sirens as villains. The biggest problem is that the game doesn't do much with them as characters. Heck, in its original release, almost none of them even spoke. These little bits of dialogue you're seeing on screen was something added in the update, and while it does turn them into actual characters now, the Sirens are still, for the most part, treated more like your average set of Mega Man robot masters than a serious group of villains. Because of this and their lack of interacting with the main cast as well as the mystery surrounding them, they become much less intimidating and threatening than the Pirate Master was, who, thanks to Risky, we knew enough about at the start to know that he was a massive threat. Despite those issues though, I did still really enjoy the story this time around. After Half Genie Hero's more episodic structure, it was great having a return to form. I do wish we got a little bit more focus on the other half genies, but for now it's fine. They're all likable and charming characters in their own right, with Harmony being my personal favorite. Realistically, we'll definitely get more from them in a sequel at some point, like we have with other characters in the past. The character writing is just as great as past games, though. We have tons of funny as well as charming moments and bits of dialogue from the main cast and side characters like usual, but honestly, the Seven Sirens is probably my favorite in that regard. There's a good few small moments with Mimic that were great, which I really appreciate because I don't think we get quite enough of them in the series. Squid Baron might actually have been at his absolute funniest here, and on a sort of related note, I absolutely love that we got animated cutscenes this time around. Honestly, it's great to see that wayforward's successful enough that they could bring on the talented folks at Studio Trigger to animate this game's gorgeous intro. And while the other cutscenes weren't quite as smooth or fluid, they really enhanced the experience for me. Like I said earlier, I have a love for anything that looks hand-drawn like this, and that combined with the fact that everything in the game is wonderfully hand-drawn now and not pixel art or 3D means this game has my personal favorite presentation in the series, even if Half Genie Hero's 2.5D aesthetic arguably does look better. In fact, in what I'm confident is an unpopular opinion that might surprise some of you, Shantae and the Seven Sirens post its Superstar update is my personal favorite game in the series, even if I do also think that the Pirate's Curse is definitely a bit better. Gameplay-wise, we're of course back to the more Metroidvania style of past games, with returning elements like the Magic Gauge from Rescue's Revenge and the Heart Squids from the Pirate's Curse, whom you still have to mount down for health, much to my cuteness-loving heart's dismay. In addition though, we also have new collectibles like these gold nuggets, whose purpose will become relevant in a moment, and these special monster cards enemies can drop. By collecting enough of a specific card, you can then unlock the ability to equip it to one of 3 slots, and get a bonus effect such as faster crawl speed, more damage, and less magic usage for certain spells and abilities. This is a system I really like. With 50 cards in total to collect and 3 being equipable at only one time, you have plenty of ways you can customize Shantae to fit your playstyle. In fact, it's such a cool mechanic that 2 of the extra modes the Superstar update added are built around it, with full deck mode giving you every card from the beginning, and rule breaker mode letting you equip all of them at once for maximum game breakage. As for those gold nuggets I mentioned earlier though, these are collectibles you can trade a certain amount of to specific NPCs to get monster cards for the game's main bosses, the Sirens. Out of all of them, I'd recommend gunning for the Water Lily and Coral Siren cards the most. The former increases your hair's damage output, and the latter slowly regenerates your magic gauge, which you can use to save some money on buying magic potions. As for actually exploring though, we do have some interesting changes and additions. This time around, you no longer need to dance in order to change into an animal form. By using special fusion coins that the other half genies give you, Shantae can instantly change into that animal. So this time around, it's better to think of them less as new forms and more as normal movement upgrades that happen to also change your shape. While I'm sure there'll be some people who will miss the dancing aspect of Shantae's transformations, this change makes them just as fluid and easy to use as the pirate gear for me. As for the forms themselves though, we have the Dash Newt that replaces the monkey, the Bonker Tortoise that replaces the elephant, and the Sea Frog which replaces the mermaid, but with the added challenge that it can't stop moving. Then we have the Gastro Drill for doing exactly what it says on the tin. And finally, the Jet Octo, which is basically Risky's cannon from the Pirate's Curse as an adorable pink octopus. The dancing is still important for something though. This time around, in order to help Shantae better combat the Sirens and get around the island and sunken city better, the other half-genies will loan their powers to you by using fusion stones, with each one giving you a different dance for exploration and puzzle solving. We have Plink's Seer Dance, which shows hidden platforms, part of a room, and even items. Then we have Vera's Refresh Dance, which can heal you, make plants grow for items, and in the presence of the undead, it can even revive them or damage them. Next is Zapple's Electric Dance, which can power machines and damage enemies. Finally, we have Harmony's Quake Dance, which also damages enemies, but it's primarily used for breaking these large square blocks. While all of them are useful for different situations, I ended up using the Seer Dance the most, almost entirely because of how many hidden gem pots there were. I didn't initially realize there were as many of these as there were when I first played the game, because, fun little fact, that Plink icon at the top of the screen wasn't present in the base version of the game. As part of those quality of life features I mentioned earlier, the Superstar update made it so that if you were in a room where their power could be used in some way, an icon of that half-genie's face would pop up. On a quick similar note though, said update also added markers on the map for whatever your current objective was, so this way you knew exactly where to go, which honestly probably should have been in the game normally. Getting back to the dances though, I love this mechanic. It expands on Shantae's genie powers in an interesting way, and while obviously it wasn't totally her own this time around, I love the idea of expanding on this for future games and giving her new ways to solve puzzles or affect the world with her dances that aren't just adorable animal transformations. As for the exploration itself though, I want to actually touch a little bit on the map design, because for the first time in the series, the Seven Sirens has a much more interconnected and Metroidvania feeling world to explore. I do hear some criticisms towards the areas in the sunken city feeling a bit bland in design compared to the Pirates' Curse's islands, and I can't really say those are wrong. While I can't say they all look exactly the same as one another at all, I do think most sections of the map lack a bit of a proper visual identity, with the most standout ones being the mossy biome for its, well, moss, and the sunken shipyard, with its interesting visuals and it being the place where the ships of the Sirens' victims went to after they attacked them. That being said though, even if only because of the structure, I do prefer exploring in the Seven Sirens over the Pirates' Curse. There's nothing wrong with the latter at all. I still love the Pirates' Curse's islands. It's just that with Metroidvanias, I like when each area in the world feels properly connected and not so isolated from one another. This finally brings us to the dungeons, and for the most part, I actually think they're kind of equal to the ones in the Pirates' Curse in almost every area. In fact, the only problem I have with them is that you almost always fight Risky Boots right before you rescue that dungeon's half-genie. From a narrative perspective, I get why it's like this since Risky's also important to the story's mystery, but gameplay-wise, I wish we got more varied mini-bosses. The area they have over the Pirates' Curse though, thanks to the Superstar update, is in the boss fights, because each of the Sirens are, for me, much more fun and interesting. Their great designs and each of their intro cutscenes combined with the update's added bit of dialogue make the Sirens just feel more interesting to go up against. Like before you were mostly just fighting a monster of some kind, but here you're going up against a boss that's kind of a villain in its own right. I also think the mechanics surrounding each boss are more fun to deal with or figure out, and the added bit of challenge some of them had was a nice change of pace. You know what, I actually want to touch on that difficulty though, because let me tell you, Definitive Mode's level of challenge is vastly different from what it was pre-update. Before, enemies dropped healing items like it wasn't anyone's business, and with how little damage you took, it made every fight a complete joke. There wasn't too much in the way of challenge for anything in the game. That isn't the case at all in the updated version though. Healing items dropped by enemies are less frequent, and aside from potions, they also don't heal you as much as before, and you also take a lot more damage as well. Heck, I was making sure I always had max normal potions on me for dungeons, because with my hyper-aggressive playstyle, I had a feeling I'd need a lot of them, and I was never proven wrong at all. In terms of challenge, I wouldn't say the Seven Sirens Definitive Mode even remotely touches Friends Till the End, but compared to the original version of the game, I'd say the difficulty is in a much more balanced state than before. Honestly, despite its problems with the storytelling for the Sirens and the map design being a bit bland, there's plenty of things about Seven Sirens that just really click with me. I like that we get to meet more half-genies and how many doors it opens for new things in the series, both story-wise and mechanically. The presentation with its animated cutscenes and fully hand-drawn aesthetic does a lot for me, and it really makes me hope these games can get an animated series at some point, because I think a lot of people will agree with me when I say it's perfect for one. While the Pirates' Curse is definitely a bit better, I had so much fun with the Seven Sirens thanks partly to the update's changes that I can't help but like it more than every other game in the series so far. So for my thoughts before we end things off, I'd encourage you to give this series a try for yourself if you haven't already. While I'd only recommend the first game to those who have the patience for it, I can easily recommend the rest to anyone at all. There's a level of charm in these games I don't see much from Metroidvanias, and heck, as Metroidvanias, they're pretty different than what you're used to thanks partly to its more Zelda-like dungeons and progression. fun. Like I've said before, I'd recommend starting with Pirate's Curse the most. It's a great and solid game that, like every game in this series, doesn't require you to play anything else to fully enjoy it. But really, you can start with any of them if you like. You don't truly need to play any other game in the series to fully enjoy another one, and I think they're all good for one reason or another. And hey, if you do end up liking them, maybe consider keeping an eye out for Risky's Revolution later this year. I don't know if it'll be as good as the Pirate's Curse, but from the trailers, it looks like it'll be a pretty good time in its own right, and hey, this series could always use the extra support. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.